All right, guys. So we're going to go ahead and go over developed versus developing countries. So we are officially on our last topics for world studies. We made it to the end. So let's go over these. So in a developed nation, you have more advanced and a more modern society. It's usually the northern countries, but a developing nation, the nations are working towards becoming a developed nation. These are often called second or third world countries. We don't really use those terms anymore. We've kind of switched to developed and developing. So, in developed countries, some examples of these countries are high standards of living, you have a lot of educational opportunities, good medical care, you have a longer life expectancy, so that means you live longer, clean drinking water, and more food is available, technology, communications, and transportation availability. Developed nations have the most money in the world's economy. Developing nations have a lower standard of living. A lot of times the countries are in high poverty. Now, every country has poverty, but in developing nations, it's a lot higher. Little to no educational opportunities, overpopulation, so you have a lot of people. Child labor is usually used. There's poor medical care. And most of the world's resources and population are in these countries. Alright, so after the Cold War, industrialized nations in the developing world, let's see what happens there. So when the Cold War ends, Eastern and Western Europe is reunited. So you don't have like the Iron Curtain dividing communists and capitalist countries anymore. The European Union expands its trading membership, so they add more countries into their trade. Some of the positive effects are the expansion helped Europe compete with places like the US and Japan in trading with nations around the world. So they're becoming stronger and getting more money because they are trading with more countries. One of the negative effects is that it caused difficulties as different economies and cultures meet. So sometimes you have a bit of a cultural clash, which is like different customs that countries have that can affect trade. So what is legal in one country may not be legal in another country in which they are trying to trade with. So they can't trade everything that they want to trade. The U.S. is still the main superpower after the Cold War. So the U.S. has used its military might to intervene in struggles in Haiti and the Balkans and elsewhere. They kind of become like the police of the world. You have the Bush presidents who took the U.S. to war in the Middle East. You have President George H. Bush. He passed away pretty recently. He started the Gulf War with Iraq. And you had President George W. Bush, who was the president when you guys were born, started the war on terror in Afghanistan and Iraq. We're going to talk a little bit more about the war on terror today, too. So all these activities brought the U.S. into more deficit. So that's where the deficit is, where you are spending money that you don't have. So we get into more national debt. In recent years, Russia struggled with corruption and maintaining democratic freedoms under Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Putin is still in charge. He's been in charge since the 90s. He keeps finding ways to stay in power. The Russian government is pretty corrupt. It has been for a long time. So, changes in Asia. You have a lot more trade among the Pacific Rim nations. So, Japan and they're called the Asian Tigers of Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, and South Korea, all export diverse goods to developed nations. So, they're all trading more. Notice I did not say North Korea because no one trades with North Korea. So China and India have burst into the world stage as well. A lot of our stuff comes from China, as you know. Their success is due to low wages, so their workers don't get paid a lot of money. They work long hours. The workers often have to move away from their families to work, but they do have a big focus on education. People living in these countries have been subject to lower standards of living due to working conditions. So you don't have workers' rights in China. Alright, so here is a political cartoon. Let you guys think about that. So what might this cartoon be saying about the economic power in China? So here is a good graph to kind of go over what has happened after the Cold War for each country. I'm not going to go over this one with you, but you can pause it and take a look. We kind of been over these already. Alright, so struggles for the developing world. So, developing nations, they've struggled to change traditional and government-led command economies into market economies. So pretty much they've had a hard time switching how their economy is ran. So investors and lenders from the global north, which is more of the developed countries, have pushed for market reforms and finance industries in developing countries. Many of these countries will not loan out money if developing countries do not meet certain requirements. So that would be like Great Britain will not give, let's see, who we're going to say. Let's go with, I don't know, there's a lot. Let's go with Kenya. They won't give Kenya any money unless they meet like certain standards that they want. So railroads, highways, dams, and schools have been built, but it's been a struggle to maintain them due to lack of resources for many developing countries. So they have built them, but these are things that you have to constantly upkeep or they will fall apart, but they haven't had the resources to do that. Now you also have the Green Revolution, which has led to more agricultural production, which helps to feed more people, but it's put a lot of small farmers out of work. So it's got its good and its bad. Good thing is more food. Bad thing is farmers are losing their jobs. So obstacles of development. One of those is population growth. So poor families depend on child labor, and sometimes their religion encourages large family. There's a lot of different types of religions that encourage large families. Countries struggle to support more and more people. So you use child labor, which we've talked about in the past, which is not a good thing. But then you also have more people that the government may have to help support, and they can't fund it. You have economic dependence on other countries for industrialized goods. This is called interdependence. Interdependence is huge. It's where you have to rely on a country to pretty much help your own country. So they also rely on industrialized nations for technology and manufactured goods. Interdependence means that like you have to have them there or else you will struggle. All right. Challenges and changes to life in the developing world. Economic development is changing life in the global south. So women are gaining more opportunities in politics, businesses, and education. Religious fundamentalists are turning to politics to create governments that follow the traditions of certain religions. This is called a theocracy. So we've talked about monarchies with kings and queens. We've talked about democracies where people vote and have more say in what's going on in the government. Well, theocracy is like government ran on religion. So you take a major religion and that's how you run your government, according to those like religious texts. It's like the Bible or the Quran. So many people are moving from rural areas to cities to find jobs, often living in the slums. We've talked about this a little bit when we talked about industrialization. This is called urbanization. You move to more urban areas. The gap between the rich and the poor is increasing, and it is still increasing today. So you have very few super rich people, but you have a ton of poor people. And this is all over the world. So here is a pie chart to show you the differences. So in the global north, you have industrialized nations of Europe, North America, Japan, and Australia. High standards of living, consumers of most of the world's resources. Over on the global south, the orange side, you have nations of developing world. You have extreme poverty and you have most of the world's population and resources. In the middle, you have economic interdependence and environmental damage. So they rely on each other because the global north relies on the resources of the global south. The global south relies on a lot of the goods created by the global north. And then you have environmental damages. So when we talked about the rainforest being on fire, a lot of that was due to logging. So that was sad. All right, so challenges facing developing countries. You have large populations, you have child labor, economic dependence, drought, food shortages, illness, AIDS is still a big killer, especially in Africa. Loss of skilled workers, inefficient state-run industries. You have pollution, you have human rights discrimination, and you have the wage gap between the rich and the poor, and you have a need for democratic reforms. A lot of times, you get a lot of corruption in the governments, and that's one way developing countries are held back. All right, we need to talk about terrorism. Some of these things you may already know because we're going to talk about 9/11. So, a major threat to the global security today is terrorism. So, the unlawful use or threat of violence to cause fear and to advance political, religious, or ideological goals. So, terrorists often intentionally target unarmed and unsuspecting citizens during their attacks. Mainly because it grabs attention. It grabs attention when you attack people going about their days, and you don't get as much attention as people attacking a military base. So terrorism is not really a new thing. It's happened all throughout history. But they have become more prevalent within the last 200 years. Terrorism has been used to overthrow governments, fight for independence, and change society. So, terrorist attacks. The number of worldwide attacks has increased over the past few decades. Violence of attacks has also increased, so they've found more violent ways to attack people. So, like in Latin America, you have the cartel, so that's illegal drug trade. You got a lot of scary stuff going on there. England, you have the Irish Republican Army. They have fought with Britain for a while. South Asia, you have the Tamil Tigers. So in modern times, the Middle East has been the primary focus of terrorism. So why is it the Middle East that's been the primary focus? You have ongoing Arab and Israeli conflicts. So Israel was a country that was created by the United Nations, and they put it on Palestinian land. So the Palestine is not too pleased about that, and a lot of the countries in the Middle East align themselves with Palestine. So you have a lot of conflicts there. Western colonial domination led to resentment of the West among some Arabs, especially since a lot of the Middle East used to be colonies. The region is home to radical Muslim organizations claiming Islam justifies terrorist attacks against innocent civilians. Now, a majority of Muslims around the world condemn Islamic law, which is pretty extreme. There is very few, and it's really the people in these groups of radical Muslims that go for terrorism. Very few people. So, you have Islamists and Islamic fundamentalist tactics. So, the belief that the society should be governed by Islamic law. In the 1980s, organizations known as Hamas, Hezbollah, Al-Qaeda have used terrorist tactics against Israel and Western nations. Hamas seeks to destroy Israel and create a Palestinian state. Hezbollah is supported by Iran and has a primary goal of the destruction of Israel. And Al-Qaeda has a primary goal to rid the area of Western influences. You've probably heard of Al-Qaeda more than you have the other ones. So where do terrorists get their support? Iran supports Hezbollah, so it's a state-sponsored terrorism. Israel, the United States, and other nations consider Hezbollah a terrorist organization. Iran does not. Other nations see it as a legitimate resistance against movements against Israel. So, some modern attacks you may have heard of. So, September 11th, 2001. So, Al-Qaeda claims responsibility for the attack on the U.S. Trade Center in New York, the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., and Flight 93 that crashed in Pennsylvania. We are not sure if Flight 93 was going to go for the White House or the Capitol building, but we knew they were headed towards D.C. So, here is a timeline of the attacks. So, American Airlines Flight 11 hits the North Tower of the World Trade Center in New York. 15 minutes later, Flight 175 hits the South Tower. Once the South Tower was hit, that's when people realized that there was an attack. Because the first tower was hit, everybody thought, like, this might have been an accident, you know. But once the South Tower hits, that's when it got real. So, American Airlines Flight 77 hits the Pentagon in D.C. The World Trade Center South Tower collapses. Flight 93 crashes in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. There is a memorial there where it did crash. The North Tower then collapses. And then building number 7 collapses of the World Trade Center, which is next to it. So this really changed everything in the United States. Really made us boost up security. This is one of those moments that if you were alive during this time and if you were like over the age of 4, you remember where you were. I was in first grade and we pretty much had to stop everything. The teachers, made us sit on the carpet because that's what you have in middle school. We combined it 2 classes. We used to have those big TVs hanging up in the corner of the wall that would crush you if they fell on you. And the teachers pretty much watched it. We went on lockdown. We had to be quiet, and our parents came to pick us up. But days after that, you would not see a plane in the sky. Like, the whole country just shut down when this happened. So here are some pictures. That is the South Tower about to be hit. There is the South Tower starting to collapse. So that's the Pentagon. The Pentagon is shaped like a pentagon. South Tower collapses, and then the North Tower collapses soon after. Here is a line of Flight 93 and where it was taken over. The reason that it did not make it to Washington was because we did have cell phones in 2001, and families were reaching out to the people on these planes because these are huge jets, and they were telling them what was going on, and then the plane was taken over by the terrorists, and then the passengers and crew began to fight back the terrorists, and they crashed the plane. So this one, I mean, it's all sad, but this one you have a lot of like texts from families, like telling their loved ones, like, you know, I love you, but we're gonna go down, and things like that. So it's pretty sad. You can find a lot of documentaries on 9/11. So here's the crash site of Flight 93. There were no survivors. So casualties, you had 2,996 immediate deaths, including 19 hijackers. The immediate deaths include 246 victims on the four planes, which there were no survivors from any of them. 2,606 in the New York City World Trade Center and on the ground. 125 in the Pentagon, and more than 90 casualties lost to citizens in the attacks on the World Trade Center. Most of those who died were U.S. citizens. In 2007, the New York City Media Examiner's Office began to add people to the official death toll who died of illnesses caused by exposure to dust from the site. The first such victim was a woman who had died in February 2002 from a lung condition. So when the two towers fell, there was just debris and dust everywhere, which could really mess up your lungs. Additionally, you have 1,140 responders and people who worked, lived, or studied in the lower Manhattan at the time have been diagnosed with cancer. So, since 9/11, other countries have faced terrorist attacks as well. You have bombing attacks on trains and buses in Madrid, Spain, London, England, Jerusalem, Israel. You had big ones in France a couple years ago. They shot into a crowd at a concert, and then there, I think, was bombings at a mall. These attacks have spurred Spain, Great Britain, and Israel to investigate ways to use technology to improve future security for transportation systems. Since a lot of these attacks happened on public transportation, they've been working to find ways to make it safer. So, here are terrorist incidents by continent, except for the Middle East. Australia has escaped a lot of it, but you can see how the numbers have kind of gone up. So, the impact of 9/11 and how it changed pretty much everything. So, we've had new legislation pass to strengthen international and domestic intelligence. So, we have Homeland Security and the Patriot Act. Homeland Security focuses on security of the nation's borders and transportation networks. Their goal is to find who is funding terrorists and try to cut those off. So, it's all about safety and stopping the terrorists. Military actions are used, so we have sanctions and with threats to invade countries to kind of pressure them to stop supporting terrorists. We've also started the war on terror. So the way this goes is military action. So in 2001, when the Taliban of Afghanistan refused to surrender Osama bin Laden and other al-Qaeda leaders who were responsible for the attacks on 9/11, the U.S. attacked Afghanistan. The Taliban was the corrupt government running Afghanistan at the time. The U.S. led military campaigns to invade Afghanistan and forced out the Taliban government. The Taliban does still exist, but it's a lot smaller than it has ever been. So, we also, 2003, we had another U.S.-led invasion targeting Iraq and the dictator Saddam Hussein. You may have heard of both Osama bin Laden and Saddam Hussein before. So, some of the officials claimed that Saddam had weapons of mass destruction and supported anti-American terrorist groups. So, weapons of mass destruction are dangerous biological and chemical weapons, and potentially are able to develop nuclear weapons as well. So, after Saddam fell from power, which he was killed as well, they did not find any weapons of mass destruction. So, this one is a little controversial. So, you have other threats to national security. So, dangerous weapons. So, many of the countries possess weapons called weapons of mass destruction, including biological weapons, chemical weapons, and nuclear. They can cause a lot of destruction. Terrorist groups and governments seek to use these for their own purposes. You also have biological weapons. They're made with organisms and toxins found in nature. They're pretty cheap to make, and they're not really hard to make. A lot of diseases like poison, anthrax, plague, smallpox. So instead of attacking you with like bombs, they attack you with poisons and illnesses. We did have a big anthrax scare not long after 9/11. A guy was mailing anthrax through the mail, and it was killing people. So in 1972, more than 70 nations signed a treaty prohibiting the production and possession of biological weapons. Today, officials worry about mainly them being used by terrorists. So we are one of those 70 nations who says we will not use biological weapons. So, chemical weapons. Mustard gas or nerve gas uses chemical toxins to kill and injure people. These were used in both world wars. They were used in the Iran-Iraq war against Iraqi Kurds in the 1980s. Nerve gas, sarin in Tokyo subway systems, was used in 1995. And Syria has used this in recent years. Syria has used it on their own people. There is a civil war going on in Syria, and the Syrian government used it against people. Nuclear weapons. This is the biggest threat of the war in the world, is nuclear weapons. So, during the Cold War, it was just the U.S. and the Soviet Union who had them at first. But then 60 other nations decided that no one is going to use them anymore. So, people have pretty much agreed that using nukes is a bad idea because you have things like mutually assured destruction, where it's like, if you nuke me, I will nuke you, and that will kill everything. So, every nation in the world has agreed that nuclear weapons is bad. They have the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. At least 8 countries are known to possess nuclear weapons, and that's just the ones we know about. But we believe that North Korea and Iran are trying to make them. We know North Korea is trying to make them. Iran is trying to make them every once in a while until they get caught. So, why is it difficult to stop countries from developing or using nuclear weapons? One, because nuclear technology does have a legitimate use. It is used to create like power plants. Nuclear power plants. A lot of countries are getting rid of some of them. Like Germany is getting rid of some of them. We have one in Ohio. You may have heard about the one in Japan. Fukushima Daiichi. It had a meltdown. I think it was like 2014. But we do have some international concerns over the development of nuclear weapons by countries who have not signed the NNP treaty, and the problems with safeguarding the nuclear stockpiles of the former Soviet Union. So there are countries who decided that nuclear weapons is a good thing, and they didn't sign that treaty. And then you also have some of the nuclear weapons that the Soviet Union had. When they collapsed, they lost some of them. Don't really know where they are. They could be at the bottom of the ocean. Some bad people could have them. We honestly just don't know. So what can be done to stop countries from pursuing nuclear weapons? You have the International Atomic Energy Agency, who monitors countries suspected of developing nuclear weapons. So they monitor like Iran and North Korea. Countries have placed sanctions, so economic penalties, on nations considered to be nuclear threats, which is North Korea. So we don't trade with North Korea because they keep saying they're going to make nukes. So, national security summary. Violence caused by ethnic and religious hatred has been and is a significant threat to the people around the world. Nations face a risk of terrorist attacks, the use of weapons of mass destruction, and ethnic and religious conflicts. People around the world have been and continue to work hard to protect public safety. So now the big concern is public safety. So, this is just the threats to national security. We have talked about all of these. So, go ahead and do the notes questions. 2 of them you have to type, so it is going to say they're incorrect until I go back in and grade them. Don't worry, you'll get your points if you got it right. But this is going to be the last thing of notes we do, guys. We are coming to an end. So have a great day.